United States President Barack Obama traveled to Saudi Arabia about 2 weeks ago, a visit widely seen as important for bolstering strained relations between the two countries. Here now to discuss this relationship, CCTV's Nathan King. And Nathan, these two countries are close allies.
Yeah.
Why are ties so strained right now?
Well, remember, when you go back to the founding of the alliance during the Second World War, FDR and the Saudis basically came to a deal over security for Saudi Arabia in exchange for access to the oil markets. Now, what's been going on is the US now very much not so dependent on Saudi oil with the fracking boom. In fact, only 11% of its oil comes from Saudi Arabia. But it's also much more strategic. Iran, in short, essentially the deal over Iran's controversial nuclear program and bringing back Iran into the community of nations has really irked the Saudis. Saudi Arabia, of course, has a rivalry with Iran in the greater Middle East. They do not get on, one being, of course, Sunni, one being Shia. And they are seeing Washington, whether it's true or not, shift towards Tehran in terms of away from Riyadh, and that worries them as well. And there are deep differences over also regional conflicts, including Syria, of course, and the civil war in Yemen as well. So these two allies that have seen eye to eye when it comes to the Middle East peace process, when it comes to the world's oil markets, when it comes to dealing with terrorism, are now at odds on nearly all of them.
And Nathan, President Obama recently traveled to Saudi Arabia, as I mentioned. What was the point of that visit? Was he going there to smooth over ruffled feathers?
Absolutely, and from the outset, the signalling, the protocol, if you like, was not good. He was actually met at the airport by the governor of Riyadh, a very important man, but not a member of the close inner circle of the royal family. And relations have been a big problem. They was there under the auspices of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which, as you know, is a powerful group of Sunni royalist groups set up largely by the United States in the region. And they were talking about, obviously, the conflict in Syria, conflict in Yemen. And there's just a real feeling amongst the GCC, especially Saudi Arabia, that the US President Barack Obama has not done enough in Syria in terms of moving President Assad, which is a key goal of Riyadh, not backing rebels. And meanwhile, the US feels that Riyadh has not acted strongly enough against ISIL and is perhaps putting too much of its military arsenal into the civil war in Yemen without concentrating on terrorism as well. So,
right.
You know, a lot of big problems here.
There's also a development in Congress. There's a bill, that's the US Congress, making its way through the Congress, the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act. There's also a 28-page congressional document on the September 11th terrorist attacks. It's actually 28 pages that were redacted, deleted. Right. Why do these developments concern Saudi Arabia so much?
Well, this goes back to 9/11. Let's take the 28 pages first. In that report that was released by Congress, 28 pages redacted, which are considered nationally sensitive to the US and Saudi Arabia. It was George W. Bush who first did that, and the Obama administration have kept those pages out. Now, while they do not, everyone says who's seen them, point to Saudi implicity when it comes to the attacks of 9/11. Everyone knows the majority of the hijackers of those planes were from Saudi Arabia, and they may have had help or funding from elements within Saudi Arabia who may be connected to the government or the Wahhabist organizations that actually do funnel money through government agencies, especially abroad. So that's tremendously embarrassing as well. And Saudi Arabia threatening to sell off US assets, US Treasury bonds. They have about $750 billion worth as well. So that would be tremendously embarrassing. So they see this as a loss of face. And this comes down to a real difference between the US and Saudi Arabia when, of course, it comes to religion. Saudi Arabia has a Wahhabist Sunni outlook, which doesn't fit well with the US democratic system, and it's always been a problem.
Okay, Nathan, thanks. That's CCTV's Nathan King reporting. Joining us now for more on the US-Saudi relationship, we're joined by former US Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Robert Jordan. He's author of the book Desert Diplomat, Inside Saudi Arabia Following 9/11. Ambassador, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
What is your assessment of the current state of relations between the United States and Saudi Arabia? Is what we're seeing now just a bump on the road, or is there something more serious going on here?
Well, I think it's more than a bump on the road, but we've had these moments before. Remember the Arab oil embargo in 1973. We've had other incidents like this. So I think we'll probably survive it, but it is something that's serious, and I think it's something that needs a lot of attention on both sides.
The Saudis are unhappy with the United States for a variety of reasons. One of them is that there's a bill currently going through Congress which could see families of 9/11 victims hold Saudi Arabia legally responsible for those attacks. There's the Iran nuclear deal, which Saudi Arabia is unhappy about. There's questions over the U.S. commitment to the Middle East. President Obama was recently in Saudi Arabia. Was he able to placate the Saudis on these concerns?
No, I think it was quite telling that they had a press conference in which they did not really announce any kind of joint agreement. They simply said they had a very frank exchange of ideas. I suspect that's an understatement.
Was this about a renewed commitment to Arab issues on the part of President Obama, or was this him just saying goodbye and thanks for my 8 years in office?
Well, I think he's tried to show a renewed commitment, but it's been more talk than action. They had the meeting in Camp David. They had another meeting in Washington. I think King Salman has not been convinced of American willingness to really take the action that they keep promising. And so this was another installment in that episode, in that exchange of views. I do think, though, that by and large we have very common interests, and I think they did recognize that. We have an interest in fighting terrorism. We have an interest in a stable price of oil. We have an interest in making progress in the Muslim world and certainly in fighting ISIS and the other terrorist elements. So there's a community of interest that I think probably goes beyond the differences that we have seen expressed.
And is this also a case of the U.S. priorities being elsewhere in the world right now? Its strategic interests, its security interests being in other places, not in the Middle East?
Well, I think that's the way this administration has pitched it, but I think they have ignored really some very important American vital interests in the course of this. They've walked away from Iraq. They have turned Libya upside down without any follow-through. So we've seen, I think the Saudis are very concerned that the Americans still have reason to be present, reason to play a leadership role, and they're not playing that role.
So in a sense, are the Saudis in some way justified at being angry with the United States right now?
Well, I think there is some reason for them to be concerned. You know, the old saying is just because you're paranoid doesn't mean someone's not out to get you. And I think there is reason behind some of their concerns. For example, the demise of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt. The Saudis saw that happen and saw this administration embraced the Muslim Brotherhood, and they said, if this can happen to Mubarak, why can't it happen to us? I think they've seen the red line in Syria ignored, in addition to the items that you mentioned earlier. So I think there is a long list of grievances that, from a Saudi national interest standpoint, have some legitimacy. Right,
and those items that I was talking about, let's look at that bill that's currently making its way through Congress.
Yeah.
If it passes, if it becomes law, Saudi Arabia has threatened to sell off United States assets amounting to hundreds of billions of dollars. I mean, could there be serious damage here?
Well, I think that's probably more of a threat than a likely scenario. My guess is that bill will not go forward, and the president has threatened to veto it if it does. But I think the Saudis would probably be hurting themselves more than anyone by selling off those assets in the United States.
What about the Saudi aid for rebels who are fighting in Syria right now? It seems to work against United States interests, doesn't it? Because much of this aid ends up in the hands of groups like Islamic State.
Well, I don't know exactly about Islamic State. Certainly some ends up in the hands of al-Nusra, which is an al-Qaeda front. And so I think there is some reason for concern there. The Saudis are very frustrated that there has not been enough progress in fighting ISIS or the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria. And I think they feel frustrated and are basically trying to find and cobble together any kind of coalition they can. I think it is dangerous for them to be supporting groups that we consider to be allies of al-Qaeda or allies of the Islamic State.
Do you think the relationship with Saudi Arabia could ever get back to what it used to be like?
I think there's a chance with leadership on both sides. Again, as I say, we have many, many common interests. Many Saudis still send their kids to be educated in the United States. They vacation here. I think one of the difficulties we have, of course, is the Saudi religious practices and some would say extremism propagated around the world that causes a lot of Americans to not have a particularly friendly view of of Saudi Arabia. But I think it's important for us to recognize these common interests and show the leadership that's necessary to get to know each other personally. There has not really been a personal connection between King Salman and the American leadership. I think the next president, whoever that is, has a chance of restoring that.
Is the broad relationship the United States has with the Middle East being seen very differently by the Saudis? The United States feels that it can be friends with Iran, it can also be friends with Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia looks at it, you've got to be friends with us or them, not both of us.
Well, friends is probably the wrong word here. There are really no permanent friends and permanent enemies. You have mutual interests, and alliances can shift. I don't think right now there's really talk of being friends with Iran, certainly not at a time when they're sponsoring Hezbollah and Hamas, threatening Israel, our strong allies. So I think it's probably extreme to say we're looking to be friends with Iran. But we do have some common interest with Iran as well, and we want to see a stable Middle East. The Saudis, I think, are having a hard time accepting that, and this is something that we've just got to continue to work through.
And I'm just wondering whether we're reading too much into this. When I say we, I mean us in the media and perhaps others as well. Because when we look at what's being said about this relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia, that's one thing. But when we look at the business deals that are being done, especially the arms sales to Saudi Arabia from the United States, it's still on a solid footing. The United States continues to sell billions of dollars worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia.
That's exactly right. We have about $96 billion worth of orders on the books right now. This is a very important element to segments of the American economy. It also is a very strategic importance because we have interoperability. They can operate with American forces. We train them. They come to the United States for further training and education. So this is the way alliances are built. And I think this is something that people do ignore. And I think it is an element of why this relationship is probably going to continue and will survive this impediment that we're seeing right now.
Right, but I guess right now it'll be very much in the hands of the next president, wouldn't it?
I think it will be. And I think getting to know each other, getting to know King Salman and whoever our president is, whoever the senior members of the administration are, is extremely important. This is a relationship that's been going on for over 70 years, and I don't think it's in anyone's best interest to simply turn our backs on them.
Ambassador Robert Jordan, thanks for joining us, sir.